Hey guys, tonight we explore what medieval people were terrified of mirrors. Walk into a room with a mirror today, and you barely think twice about glancing at your reflection to check your hair or straighten a collar. It's an idle, almost thoughtless habit, but if you could step back a few centuries and hand that same glass mirror to someone in a medieval village, they wouldn't look at it with vanity. They would look at it with a cold, creeping dread. To the medieval mind, a mirror wasn't just a piece of polished home decor. It was an unsettling distortion of reality, a literal trapdoor for the soul, and a window that looked back at you with a mind of its own. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's late, the hearth has burned down to a patient bed of embers, and the stitched curtains breathe with the night. Imagine then a small room in a tumble-down house somewhere in medieval Europe. Timber beams dark with smoke, a bed draped in wool, a child asleep on a straw mat, and a single object that would, for most of us now, feel perfectly ordinary. A piece of polished metal or a thin panel of glass set in a wooden frame, catching the moon through a slit in the shutters and returning it as a pale, inverted world. That reflected world is where the fear begins. The mirror is quiet and still, but it promises that there is another you, a version of your face that moves when you move, that smiles when you smile, that might not always obey the mind behind your eyes. This fear is not simply a quaint superstition. It's woven into the rhythms of medieval life, into the sermons, the household practices, the stories that mothers whisper at bedtime, and the legal codes that sometimes punish those who look too long or too eagerly into reflective surfaces. To understand this terror, we have to step away from the bright, confident, mirror-lined world of shopping malls and selfie-lit phone screens and step into a sensory landscape where seeing was suspect, where images carried agency, and where the line between the visible and the spiritual was porous. Start with the materials. Mirrors in the medieval period were rare and expensive. A wealthy house might own a small polished bronze disc, a silvered plate, or later, when Venice's glass-making advances spread, a piece of real glass backed with an alloyed silver or mercury layer. Most people lived their entire lives without owning such a thing. Their daily reflections came from calm pools, from polished spoons, and the sheen of an oil-slicked puddle. These natural reflections were familiar, bounded, and part of a living world, the kind of thing that sang with the rhythms of the earth. But a manufactured, framed surface that offered a perfected, movable image that felt new, uncanny, and intentional. There is an intimacy to mirrors that unsettled medieval thought. Mirrors do not simply reflect, they show you yourself apart from others, isolated. In a culture woven with communal life, where identity is often negotiated through kinship, reputation, and the visible signs of devotion, the private, self-contained gaze that a mirror invites could feel dangerously individual. To stand before a mirror was to stand alone with your face, and standing alone was not always safe. In tales and sermons, isolation opens one up to temptation, to the whispering of demons, to the cunning of sorcery. The Church, the most powerful moral arbiter of the age, played a complicated role in shaping how people thought about images. Holy images, icons, frescoes, reliquaries, were everywhere in churches and chapels, and they were treated with reverence because they mediated the presence of saints and the divine. An icon might be kissed, an image might sweat or weep, and these were interpreted as signs of God's active, caring presence. That same agency, however, could be feared when it appeared in the wrong context. A mirror's image could look too much like life without being life. It could be copied, but without the sacred purpose of an icon. Priests warned against temptations of vanity, which could swell the heart toward pride, and vanity was often depicted as an opening for other sins. The reflective surface, by encouraging private contemplation of one's own beauty, was a potential trap, a mirror that could feed the soul's vanity and slide one toward spiritual ruin. At the same time, mirrors were implicated in a broader cosmology of likeness and doubleness. Medieval people thought in terms of correspondences. The earth mirrored the heavens, the human body mirrored the cosmos, and images could be signs of deeper realities. To have an image that so perfectly mimicked a human face invited questions. Was the reflection merely a portrait, an obedient copy? Or was it something more dangerous, an imitation with a life of its own, a vessel for shadows, a possible host for spirits? Stories proliferated in which reflections ran ahead of, or lagged behind their owners, in which a reflected hand pointed to a danger the real one could not yet see, in which a person glimpsed a different fate in the face staring back at them. Consider folk tales and oral traditions. In the dark, nightly storytelling sessions, mirrors make excellent motifs because they speak to the uncanny. One recurring motif is the notion of a mirror as a trap for the soul. People believed that the soul, especially at moments of vulnerability, illness, childbirth, sleep, could detach or be lured away. A reflective surface might attract it, hold it or confuse it, and those without strict rituals or proper protections risked losing something essential. Imagine a mother at her bedside, her newborn between her arms, a small mirror on the wall catching the firelight. She might worry, not simply about burglars or sickness, but about the possibility that a careless glance of a sleeping infant at midnight could anchor part of their being to that glossy panel. Superstitions grew up. Cover mirrors in the sick room, hide mirrors while someone sleeps. Do not allow a dead person's face to be reflected, lest their soul mistake the surface for an exit. These practices, with their careful coverings and whispered instructions, became habitual because people had seen enough odd things and heard enough stories that they were willing to be cautious. Mirrors were also associated with sorcery and witchcraft. The medieval imagination was fertile ground for the idea that objects, when shaped and treated by skilled hands, could become instruments of power. A mirror, made in secret by an artisan who mixed metals and fire, could be turned toward malice. Accounts in trial records, chroniclers' notes, and moralizing pamphlets speak of conjurers who used shiny surfaces to deceive or to cast the eye over a distance. Some were thought to use mirrors to spy on enemies, to scry, a term older than the Renaissance occultists, but rooted in the same impulse, seeing what was hidden in distant places. Others were accused of using mirrors as repositories for stolen images, holding the likenesses of victims captive and manipulating them. These accusations were dangerous, because in a world where the invisible could affect the visible, being suspected of using a mirror for ill purpose could have fatal consequences. But the fear surrounding mirrors was not all about superstition and witch hunting. There were aesthetic and moral anxieties about images and identity. Medieval literature is full of stories where the reflection reveals a character's true nature, or where the face in the glass betrays a hidden illness, a moral stain, or a future wound. Poets and moralists used the mirror as a rhetorical device. To look into a mirror was to confront truth, or to be seduced by falsehood. The act of gazing could be a moment of revelation or a precipice. Think of the vivid, quiet terror in a monk's meditation, the mirror of conscience held up to the man, reflecting not vanity but the small, stubborn impurities that lead to pride, greed, or sloth. The mirror was an instrument of introspection, and for some, an instrument of accusation. Practical concerns made the mirror more threatening still. Glass production in medieval Europe was concentrated in particular regions, most famously Venice. Venetian mirrors, backed with a thin layer of mercury, an alloy known as verta, in some accounts were prized for their clarity, but feared for their otherworldly perfection. To see oneself in a Venetian mirror, to view an image that was smoother than any pond or polished metal, could be startling. The image was cleaner, almost too perfect, and that perfection was suspect because it suggested artifice. It suggested human mastery over nature that flirted with pride. Venetian workshops guarded their recipes jealously, because beyond commercial secrecy, there was a sense that they were controlling a craft that interfaced with human perception in uncanny ways. The mirror workshop, a dim place of molten glass and dangerous vapors, could itself become mythic. Emissaries whispered of master glassmakers, who bent light like sorcerers, and of mirrors that worked only for their maker, or those who understood their secret inscriptions. Public rituals around mirrors further complicated their place in medieval life. In courts and noble households, mirrors were used in dressing and display, yes, but also in ceremonies. A noble might be presented with a mirror as a symbol of status, authority, and refinement. To give someone a mirror was to say they had attained a higher station, a capacity for self-presentation and governance. E.t. that very presentation could carry deep anxieties about self-awareness and the performance of identity. When a ruler looked into a mirror, were they seeing the office reflected back, or only the hollow costume of power? Portraits and mirrors together formed a discourse about authenticity. The face in the glass might be read as a mask, and masks in medieval imagination often had sinister associations, illusions, disguises, things that hid the truth. Another thread in the tapestry is medical theory. Medieval medicine, rooted in Galenic humours and layered with local folk practices, had its own ideas about the body as a porous, vulnerable system. Wounds and illnesses could affect more than tissue, they could affect the soul's balance and a person's identity. The reflection, being a visual copy of appearance, could be read diagnostically. A pallid reflection might portend fever. Sunken eyes in a mirrored face might confirm a hidden consumption. This practical use blurred into superstition. If a mirror showed symptoms that a body hid, was it telling a truth the flesh would not? Conversely, could a mirror mislead a practitioner, showing what the body did not truly contain? When visual evidence counted for so much, the thought that a mere surface could deceive physicians, or reveal them to be wrong, was unnerving. Consider also the psychology of sight. Medieval minds often privileged sight as the highest sense, the eye a window to knowledge, an organ by which God might be perceived. Vision was thought to carry weighty moral consequence. To see was to know, and to know carried responsibility. If an image could influence the will, as many religious teachers argued, then what you looked at mattered. The reflection in a mirror could be a temptation towards self-absorption. It could be a source of pleasure that distracted the soul from prayer and duty. The picture of a woman combing her hair before a looking-glass appears in medieval accounts as a site of seduction, and men and women were warned against the pleasures of preening. Moralists penned admonitions about the vanity of mirrors, elaborating on how such objects fed a love of outward beauty rather than inward virtue. But the fear was not only moral or metaphysical. There were practical superstitions tied to life transitions. In many regions, mirrors were covered during funerals, or removed from display when someone died. The reasons offered varied. Some held that a corpse's gaze might become trapped. Others believed that the bereaved might see the dead in the glass and be tormented. Some households believed that leaving mirrors uncovered during mourning could invite the dead back into the room, confusing their passage to the afterlife. These customs were not mere theatrics. They were acts of protection and of ritual ordering in a time when death was a frequent visitor. The coverings, shrouds, and turned faces were gestures that maintained the boundary between the living's world and the unsettled spaces of death. Mirrors also appear in medieval law codes and municipal ordinances, though not always in ways we would expect. In some towns, authorities regulated the sale and display of looking glasses, because they had commercial value and because they were associated with behaviors deemed indecorous. Guilds controlled mirror making, and statutes could outline who was allowed to sell such luxury. In other instances, mirror-related accusations cropped up in court records, sometimes as evidence of moral failing, sometimes as proof of magical practice. The presence of a mirror in an accused person's house could be presented as a sign of immoral indulgence or nefarious craft. That such an ordinary object could become a piece of legal evidence speaks to its loaded symbolism. If we look beyond Europe, we find a variety of mirror-related beliefs that illuminate the medieval mindset. In the Islamic world, ornate polished metal mirrors were common, and poetry often used the mirror as a symbol for the relationship between lover and beloved, or between the prophet and the divine. In Byzantine culture, icons and reflective surfaces served as theological tools, and yet suspicion sometimes attached to mirrors too, when they seemed to imitate sacred images without reverence. The cross-cultural echoes suggest that the uneasy relationship with mirrors was not merely a European quirk, but part of a wider human grappling with representations of the self, with what it means to be seen, and to see oneself seen. All of this, material rarity, moral anxiety, folk practice, legal entanglement, medical curiosity, and cross-cultural echo, but stories often do the best work of making fear palpable. So let me tell you a few of the kinds of tales that parents might have told to keep children from lingering in front of a mirror. There is a widespread motif of the mirror as a portal for witches. In one version, a young girl is dared to gaze into an old man's mirror at midnight. She does, and the reflection, at first dutiful, begins to lag, sulk, then smile in ways that the girl never does. The reflection steps aside and leaves the glass. A pale hand reaches from inside and tugs at the girl's sleeve. She flees, but when lights are brought, the mirror shows her a figure with a face slightly wrong. A little too wide, a little too still. The family, alarmed, smashes the glass and prays over the shards. Such stories teach caution. The glass may be an ordinary object, but in the wrong hour, at the wrong light, it can betray you. Another tale speaks of an apprentice glassmaker who, in his ambition, tried to perfect a mirror sharper than any. He mixed metals in secret, whispered prayers, neither saintly nor blasphemous, and worked through the night. When dawn came, the mirror showed him a face he did not recognize, older, hollowed, and looking back with a contempt that stung. The apprentice grew obsessed. He spent days before the glass, trying to coax the face into a smile. He forgot to sleep. He lost weight. His master warned him that in seeking to craft an image of perfection, he had let the mirror craft him. One morning he was gone, and the mirror stood empty on the bench, reflecting only the pale workshop walls. Townsfolk said he had been taken by the same perfection he sought, swallowed perhaps by his own reflection. The tale ends as many do, a warning about hubris, mingled with the uncanny unknown. Stories like these are not just entertainment, they are behavioral tools. In a world without mass education, narratives teach norms. If parents want their children to avoid vanity, they recount tales of mirror-induced ruin. If magistrates want to curb the spread of exotic objects that upset social equilibrium, they let rumor do part of the work. And rumor is powerful. It feeds on the things people do not understand. When a household boasts a Venetian-looking glass that flattens faces into a clearer, crueler truth, neighbors who have never set foot in the house may weave explanations about sorcery, about bargains with spirits, about artisanal pacts with the devil. The church's response was sometimes to fold mirror-related anxieties into familiar moral frameworks, at other times to outright condemn the use of reflective objects in certain contexts. Preachers warned that, and I'm paraphrasing the typical tenor, to spend hours before the mirror is to court the devil's court, to admire the flesh rather than the soul. Monastic rules often regulated mirrors in terms of the cell and cloister. A monk's mirror, if present, was for necessary grooming only, not for indulgent staring. Some orders forbade them entirely, preferring mortification to self-reflection. The theological reasoning tied into asceticism, a discipline that prized the will's control over bodily desire. A mirror that encouraged the eye to linger undermined this discipline. But the church could be pragmatic. Not all mirrors were sinful. In the hands of a midwife, a small mirror could assist childbirth. In the hands of a surgeon, it could help see blisters or wounds. Applied medicine and applied craft sometimes required the very object that moralists distrusted, so practical use carved out exceptions. The mirror for skill, for saving life, for necessary commerce, but not for idle pleasure. Beyond moral instruction, mirrors served as metaphors in devotional literature. Mystical writers sometimes used the mirror as a likeness for contemplation. The soul should be like a polished mirror, obediently reflecting God's light without distortion. The mystic's mirror was interior, an inner clarity that allowed divine truth to shine forth. This positive use of the mirror complicates the portrait. It shows that medieval thought did not simply reject images. Rather, it debated how images should be used, who had access to them, and what kinds of reflection were spiritual rather than self-serving. There are concrete, eerie anecdotes in medieval chronicles that capture the mood in ways generalizations cannot. One chronicle records a lord who hung a large mirror in his hall to show off his wealth. Guests came, and at feast times they would pass the glass around, admiring their finery. One evening, during a plague scare, the mirror was said to have clouded, not with dirt, but with a greyness that reflected only the dead. Whether this is literal truth, embellishment, or misremembered coincidence is less important than the social effect. The miracle or omen cast the object into suspicion, and the hall's mirror was quickly covered, then smashed, its broken pieces buried. The narrative reinforces the association between mirrors and the precarious boundary between life and death. Trade and travel also spread mirror. Law merchants voyaging between the Levant, Byzantium, and the West carried objects and ideas, and with them came stories about the power of images. Travelers told of mirrors used in divination in far countries, of shamans peering through polished bowls to reveal future events, and of tricksters who used mirrors to create illusions in marketplaces. Each tale added new layers to local imaginations. An ordinary villager, who had never seen a Venetian mirror, might hear a trader's tale and interpret a shiny spoon in a different light thereafter, attributing to it qualities it did not possess simply because their mental map now contained tales of scrying and sorcery. As the late medieval period rolled into the 15th and 16th centuries, the production of glass and the distribution of mirrors increased. Workshops flourished, and mirrored surfaces edged into more households. This spread did not dissipate fear overnight. Instead, the anxiety shifted. Where mirrors were once treasures of rare power, they became common tools that prompted negotiated uses. Etiquette manuals began to advise on modest conduct in front of the mirror, and artisans adopted marks and signatures to distance their craft from sorcery, a rational industry's way of sanitizing its image. Still, older beliefs persisted stubbornly in folk practice. Farmers might still cover their cottage's mirror during a funeral long after their city counterparts had simply rearranged the parlor. In literature and the arts, mirrors continued to perform a special function. Artists loved the optical problems that mirrors posed. They allowed for complex compositions, for double images, and for meditations on seeing. A painted mirror in a Renaissance work could show what the subject does not know, highlight a secret, or expose a moral double take. The tendency of painters to insert mirrors and reflections into scenes is a dialogue with the broader cultural unease. The painter uses the mirror to question what is real and who is watching. Viewers, in turn, were invited into a game to consider their own act of looking and what consequences might follow. There were also technological anxieties. As mirrors improved, they suggested a mastery over nature that worried theologians and laypeople alike. If humans could shape clear images at will, what else could they shape? The mastery at playing glass-making, manipulating fire, sand and metal to bend light, flirted with the Renaissance ideal of human power over the natural world, a concept that would later be seized upon with celebration and fear alike. In the medieval moment, that mastery sometimes read as hubris, an attempt to create lifelike images that blurred the divine prerogative. And in quiet corners of households, ordinary domestic rituals reveal the deep-seated ways people negotiated mirrors. A woman preparing for Mass might check her veil in a small mirror, not to preen but to ensure propriety. A tailor might use a looking glass to judge cut and drape. A scribe might glance at a polished sheet to make certain a seal's impression read correctly. Each practical engagement with reflective surfaces shows how functional and fearsome the same object could be, depending on context. What reassured was often a ritual, the mirror sanctified by use for work, the mirror hidden during rites, the mirror blessed or kept in a chest when not needed. Yet even as mirrors were folded into everyday life, their capacity to unsettle remained potent. That is perhaps why the motif endured in moral sermons, in rumors, in the small rituals people performed. The look in a glass could both comfort and betray. It could permit skilled hands to repair a garment, and it could invite a sly spirit to slip into the world. It could be an instrument for a physician and a talisman for a conjurer. This duality, the mirror as both tool and threshold, is central to the medieval terror. It meant that no matter the person's status, wealth, or piety, the mirror demanded attention and caution. Now, let us imagine a particular evening in a modest manor in the late 14th century. A lord and his wife, returning from the chapel, hang their cloaks and move toward a small parlour where a polished plate hangs in a wooden frame. The plate is not glass but polished silver, faintly clouded at the edges. The Lord, call him Geoffrey, has been praised that week for his generosity to the poor and his horse training. But there are rumours that his steward has been embezzling funds. Geoffrey stands before the plate and almost absent-mindedly glances at his face. In the pale light, he sees not only his own features, but another image behind them, a faint image of the steward's cheekbones, a smudge of guilt he cannot quite place. Startled, Geoffrey looks away. He tells his wife of the vision, and she tells the priest at the chapel. The priest listens, and he interprets. Mirrors reveal concealed dispositions of the heart. You must pray and repent. Geoffrey, meanwhile, begins to suspect his steward. Whether the mirror actually showed this trace is less important than what the belief produced. It acts. It changes behaviour, prompting inquiry, confession, and perhaps the restoration of funds. The mirror in this scene is an actor, not because it is magic, but because people invest it with meaning. Stories of such incidents multiply in diaries, in margins of manuscripts, and in the effusions of wandering clerics. They tell us how the mirror functions socially as a catalyst for action, a provoker of moral self-scrutiny, and sometimes as an impetus for violence. It may lead to justice and the uncovering of corruption. It may equally lead to mistrust and accusation. The reflective surface, because it seems to know, is an unreliable but potent witness. We should also note the gendered dimension of mirror fear. Much of medieval admonition about mirrors centered on women, though men were not immune. The ideal of feminine modesty and the fear of feminine vanity made the mirror a frequent target in homiletic literature addressing women's conduct. Female preening before a glass was often visual shorthand for spiritual waywardness. Yet women also used mirrors in roles of power, as midwives, as healers, and as keepers of domestic order. The female practitioner who used a small-looking glass to inspect a wound or to assist in childbirth was performing essential labour. But that same woman, when found with a private mirror burned to a glow of polished clarity, could be accused of witchcraft because she wielded image, making in ways unknown to male authorities. This tension builds towards some of the most charged mirror accusations in witch trials of later centuries. The alleged use of mirrors in maleficum, harmful magic, often appears in testimonies. A neighbour says they saw a woman with a mirror approach. A herd and the cows fell ill. Another says a child fell into a stupor after the accused offered a shiny object. Such testimony, often thin and anchored in rumour, nevertheless carried lethal consequences. Here again the mirror's ambiguous status, useful in household craft, dangerous in alleged sorcery, becomes a theatre for gendered power struggles and social anxieties about who controls knowledge and who can manipulate images. There is a quieter, more personal fear too. The fear that your face in the mirror might show what your soul hides. For many in the medieval world, the face was not a passive map of features, but a dynamic record of the soul's state. A weathered face marked by sorrow told of past sins or sufferings. A smooth, unlined countenance could indicate spiritual purity or a crafty masking. The mirror, by rendering that surface visible, seemed to threaten to reveal secret thoughts. This is why confessional practices and mirror gazing sometimes intersected. Both were acts that promised disclosure. A sinner might be told to look upon themselves, to see their pride reflected, and to repent. But looking long could also invite despair, and despair was a mortal sin. The balance was precarious. the mirror as penitent tool or as temptation toward fatal misgiving. And so night after night, family after family, community after community, negotiated with the looking glass. They covered it, they blessed it, they consulted it in times of need, they smashed it in times of threat. Each act reasserted boundaries that reflected anxieties much larger than mere superstition. They were about the nature of identity, the limits of human agency, and the protection of souls in a world where the seen and unseen were braided together. As people traveled to fairs and markets, as artisans moved from city to city, as religious reformers preached and poets wrote, the conversation around mirrors evolved. Yet the fundamental human unease remained. Mirrors show us ourselves, and seeing ourselves so closely invites questions that have always been difficult. Who am I? What part of me is merely outward? Can an image be trusted? Is the image a true companion or a cunning stranger? The medieval mind answered these questions with rituals, stories, warnings, and sometimes violence, each response a way to manage a deep-rooted uncertainty. Tonight, as you listen, think of the simple act of looking into your phone's front camera, of lighting a small lamp and drawing your face into view. Feel the ease with which you might check a stray hair, the casualness with which you may pull a face at your reflection. Now imagine the same moment in a darkened hall centuries ago, where the light is thin and the reflective surface is rare. Imagine the hush that falls over a room when someone draws near such a surface. The hush not only of surprise, but of respect, of fear, of ritualized caution. Imagine also the private conversation the room holds. The parent's whispered instructions to a child, the priest's quiet counsel, the old woman's muttered charm to protect a child's glance. That hush is part of what made mirrors menacing. It wrapped the object in the serious business of guarding the soul. In those quiet lives, a mirror's presence mattered. It could mean status and vanity, blessing and curse, diagnosis and deceit. The reflection was never merely an image. It was an interlocutor, a potential agent in the moral economy of the household. And because the stakes were high, because souls, honor, and life itself hung upon the body's condition and the community's perception, the smallest reflective plane could exert an influence out of proportion to its size. There is also the matter of language and metaphor. In medieval sermons and sermons notes, preachers loved to twist the language of vision into moral teaching. Phrases like, "the mirror of the Lord," or "the soul as mirror" appear in many texts, weaving theological reflection into quotidian vocabulary. Mirrors thus became tools for thinking about imitation, about how humans are made in God's image, and may either reflect the divine or distort it. This dual potential cut both ways. It was a language of promise and one of peril. To reflect God correctly was the highest aim, but to misrecollect, to imitate vanity instead, was a fall. As the centuries turned, and more people encountered mirrors, new rituals emerged to accommodate them. Some households began to keep small mirrors in locked chests, bringing them out only for weddings, for courts, or for important liturgical festivals. Others used mirrors to teach children household skills, to instruct them in proper appearance as a sign of social standing. In this way, the mirror's role shifted from being an object of terror to being an instrument of socialization. But traces of that terror remained lodged in customs and in stories passed down. Even so, in the margins of illuminated manuscripts you sometimes find curious depictions of mirrors that capture the anxiety perfectly. A noble woman peers into a small disk, and within it is not only her face, but a miniature scene of judgment. Angels and devils squabbling over the soul's reflection. These images are not mere caricature, they register a real cultural tension. Artists, thinkers, and ordinary people grappled with the mirror as a paradoxical object, capable of revealing truth, and of concealing it, of aiding life, and of undermining it. The net result is a medieval mirror lore that is rich and messy, filled with contradictions that teach us about the complexity of past fears. If you let your attention drift now, imagine a caravan of traders bringing a chest of mirrors into a town square. The mirrors gleam in the sun, Children crowd around. Mothers hold them at arm's length. The crowd murmurs, some in wonder, some in dread. A woman lifts a silver plate to her face and laughs. An older man steps back, muttering a prayer. A priest watches from the church steps and thinks of the homilies he will give the following Sunday about the dangers of idle looking. This little scene captures the social choreography around mirrors. Fascination, skepticism, ritual, and didacticism braided together. There were also small, practical superstitions that grew up around mirrors that tell us a lot about how people tried to manage fear. If a mirror fell and broke, some believed it brought 7 years of bad luck. Others saw it as a sign that something in the household's balance had shifted. If a bride saw herself in a mirror and liked what she saw too much, relatives might tease her about vanity. If she found her reflection disagreeable, some would whisper that the marriage might be difficult. Mirrors became a shorthand for outcomes, a way for uncertain people to anchor their futures in a visible token. As we listen to these ways of thinking, remember that medieval minds did not live in a single monolithic superstition. There were erudite theologians and crusty villagers, pious nuns and pragmatic midwives, each with their own relationship to reflective surfaces. What ties their stories together is an attentiveness to the volatile border where the visible world meets the spiritual. Mirrors occupied that border like nothing else, because they rendered people visible in an utterly intimate way. That intimacy was thrilling and threatening in equal measure. Now, as the night deepens and your breathing slows, picture one more scene, a small cottage on the edge of a village. Light from a lopsided candle slants across a roughly polished bowl propped on a windowsill. An elderly woman, a healer perhaps, fills it with water and drops in a crushed herb. She leans close not to see her face, but to see if the water shudders in a way that will tell her whether the fever will break. She whispers a charm, watches the ripple, and nods. For her, the reflective surface is not an instrument of vanity, but a tool for care. In that moment, the mirror's meaning is practical and tender, not terrifying. And yet, of course, terror persists elsewhere. In the same village, a child who glimpses their own face in a puddle at night may be frightened by the hollow look that seems to belong to someone older. The child may run home to their mother, and together they might cover the puddle with straw until morning. Two responses to similar phenomena, one of ritual care, one of protective fear, coexist comfortably in the same cultural space. That coexistence is what makes the medieval relationship with mirrors so textured. It was not simply an all-encompassing fear, but a complex set of attitudes and practices that depended on who you were, what you needed, and how you made meaning of what you saw. If you imagine the medieval mind as a house with many rooms, mirrors moved between those rooms as objects both useful and suspect. They sat in the workshop next to hammers and tongs. They hung in the hall near tapestries and heraldry. They rested on a midwife's shelf beside herbs and bandages. They were sometimes hidden under a cloak when a funeral passed. Each placement tells a story about how households accommodated the risk of reflection. There is a particular kind of medieval anxiety I want you to feel now, because it captures the essence of why mirrors could be terrifying. The fear that in looking too closely at oneself, one might discover too much. The face might show not simply a present identity, but a possible future, an illness, an addiction, a moral failing. That is different from modern vanity. Modern mirror, gazing often seeks affirmation. Medieval mirror, gazing, when it happened, risked revelation. The revelation could be cleansing if it led to repentance, but it could also be crushing if it led to despair. The moral technologies of the age, confession, penance, the sacraments, were meant to manage these revelations, but they could not always prevent the private terror that occurred when someone saw a face they no longer recognized. In truth, the fear of mirrors in medieval life was never uniform. It varied according to region, social class, religion, and individual experience, but its persistence across time and space suggests that the mirror tapped into something universally delicate, the human discomfort with being reflected back at ourselves in a way that seems to set us apart from the world we belong to. That sense of estrangement, the idea that the object you face, might occasionally act like a liar, a trickster, or a mirror that keeps too much, underpins much of the lore we've traced tonight. And as we move forward in this tale, there are places where that estrangement deepens, legal cases that hurl a mirror into the center of a witch trial, devotional texts that turn mirror language into spiritual therapy, and artisans who guard their methods as if they are holders of a dangerous secret. Each of these threads leads us further into the heart of the story, into the ways that society negotiated power, fear, and identity through a small, often overlooked object. Listen closely now as our story follows a single mirror through years and hands, carrying with it whispers of commerce, hints of scandal, and glimmers of devotion. Imagine it first in the hands of a glassmaker in Venice, and then packed into a chest bound for a northern port. Picture the merchant who counts its value, the noble who admires it, and the servant who hides it. Think of the conversations it catalyzes, quiet vows, accusations, prayerful blessings. Trace the mirror's slow migration across roads and seas, and watch how its meaning changes with each owner. We will follow that journey, and along the way we will meet people who fear it for different reasons. Religious thinkers who see it as temptation, healers who see it as a tool, magistrates who see it as evidence, and ordinary families who treat it as both luxury and liability. This journey will show how an object so small could bear so much weight, how an act as simple as looking could become a portent, and how the medieval mind, anxious for order and meaning, used ritual, law, and story to keep the dangers of reflection at bay. And it will bring us to a moment when a particular mirror, magnificent, well made, and perhaps cursed, enters a town and upends lives in ways no one expects. We pick up that thread in a port town, where the coastal fog seems to swallow sound, where the hired cart rattles over cobbles, and where a chest of mirrors arrives under cover of dawn. A young merchant named Aldo receives the shipment, his hands stained with tar and rope, his face eager at the thought of profit. He does not know that among those mirrored plates is one that will not only reflect faces, but will remind him of a past he has tried to forget. He is the kind of man attuned to risk, the kind who cheapens superstitions for practical gain, and yet even he will find that some fears do not bow easily to commerce. We will follow Aldo as he opens the chest, the smell of pitch and salt rising, the soft clink of silver against wood. He lifts a mirror, its back stamped with a maker's sign, and for a moment he sees the harbour behind him. Then the memory of a woman he once loved, who left him on a rainy night many years ago. The reflection is ordinary, yet it stirs him in a way he cannot rationalize. He touches the glass with the pad of his thumb, as if to move the past aside, but the thumb leaves no mark. The mirror hums a silence that seems fuller than it should be. Aldo is a rational man, used to the rough logic of trade, yet he cannot shake the sense that this particular object has something else, a claim on him. We will follow his story, and through Aldo's hands, the mirror will enter the community, changing hands, altering fates, and revealing how the medieval world makes sense of objects that both aid and threaten. The paths we take will show you intangible scenes and small human details. Why mirrors were feared, not because they were inherently malevolent, but because they complicated the fragile boundaries people depended upon, and in their complications they illuminated truths people would rather not see. Listen now as the chest creaks open, and the first mirror is revealed, bright as a small inland sun. The merchant lifts it. The world leans forward with him. The mirror holds the harbour and a memory at once. He smiles. At first, at the neatness of the reflection, at the neatness of his own face against the ragged edge of his life. But beneath that smile, there is a tremor. You can sense it in the way his fingers hesitated on the frame, as if expecting the wood to burn him. The harbour's gulls shriek in the distance. A dog barks. The mirror offers nothing but silence. Aldo wraps it carefully and puts it into his cart, not knowing yet that the simple act of moving that reflective plane will ripple outward in ways small and large. The journey has begun, and the mirror's tail will wind through markets, courts, and bedsides, catching in its surface the anxieties of a world that saw images as potent, porous, and profoundly consequential. We will continue along that road together. We will continue along that road together. The cart jolts and the chest shifts with a soft, ominous sigh. The road out of the port is narrow and lined with hedges, the kind that keep secrets as well as animals. Aldo guides his horses with a practiced hand, eyes on the ruts and on the faint bend where the road climbs. He thinks of the coin he will make, the glint of mirrors in the stalls, the noblewoman who will clamour for a piece, the status that comes with owning a true Venetian-looking glass. His mind goes through the transactions like a prayer. Buy low, sell at fair profit, keep his word. He is not a superstitious man, at least not in the way of the old tales. He believes in ledgers, in the weather, in the sharpness of a blade. Yet the mirror in the chest presses against the lid, as if to remind him that objects can carry stories, like stones carry moss. He stops at an inn on the edge of town, more to check the harness and water the animals than to satisfy any need for company. The innkeeper, a man with a flat face, and the easy humour of someone who has seen more travellers than he trusts, nods at Aldo and points to the hearth. "Bring the chest indoors," he says, and Aldo complies, for the chest's weight already suggests trouble in the night, should thieves pass through. They set it on a table near the fire, and the innkeeper's wife, curious and quick with a hand, asks what is inside. Aldo hesitates. This is a merchant's secret. But then, perhaps warmed by the hearth and the familiarity of the inn, he smiles and reveals a small corner. The wife gasps faintly. The mirror's silvered face glints like a captive moon. The wife asks to hold it. She is practical, a woman who measures flour by feel and knows the right angle to set a loaf to brown. She lifts the mirror and sees her own face, the outline of years and children and long nights. For a moment she pauses, not out of vanity, but because seeing oneself in such clear detail is like reading a letter you did not expect. She sets it down with steadiness. "It would make a fine gift," she says, "but I would not keep it uncovered in the house when a funeral comes." Her husband nods as if to signal that such knowledge is part of the communal wisdom. Aldo, listening, notes the remark, another voice in the chorus of caution, and tucks it away with the numbers in his head. Even the practical woman with flour on her hands recognizes a rule. The mirror, then, already exerts a small cultural pull on speech and behavior, shaping what is said in the room and how people might arrange their homes. By the time Aldo reaches the market, a week later, the chest has acquired a rumour. News of mirrors travels, like most novelties, by appetite and by suspicion. The market is a crowded place, a stage of commerce, where wares cluck and buyers haggle, with an urgency like that of prayer. Aldo opens his stall and lays out a handful of mirrors, each backed and polished with a care that seems almost devotional. People press, not just to touch and appraise, but to see themselves as they seldom have. A tailor looks into a small disc and adjusts a collar. A soldier, rough and sun-bleached, frowns and browses more carefully. The mirrors sell. That day, Aldo makes enough to recoup his costs and then some. The crowd's reaction surprises him, more than wealth. He sees the way people gaze at themselves and at each other, as if an ordinary act of inspection has become a communal ritual. But then a complaint is raised, not about the price, not about the glass, but about the way one mirror seemed to show. A weaver claims that onlookers gathered around a particular-looking glass saw, for a breath, not the weaver's face but the outline of a woman in old clothes standing behind him, a figure no one else could find in the square. The claim spreads, some laugh, some whisper. The local priest, an old man named Brother Martin, hears of this, and comes by the stall to see for himself. He stands, bent at the shoulders, and peers into the same pane that allegedly betrayed the weaver's ghost. For a moment he looks solemn, then shakes his head. "The devil finds work in mirrors," he says softly, not as a decree, but as an invitation into caution. His words are salt in a wound of rumour. They give the whisper meat. He sells mirrors to a scribe who will use one to examine wax seals, to a midwife who will place a small disc in her apron pocket, and to a noblewoman who bargains hard. He is careful to mark one mirror as separate, the one with the faint maker's mark on its back that seemed to trouble him. When the noblewoman asks why it costs more, Aldo invents a story about the glass being of a better clarity, the maker having been trained by a Venetian master. The woman pays the coin and leaves, and the mirror leaves the store. Aldo feels some relief, as if by passing this particular object on, he might also pass on any misfortune that clings to it. Yet the mirror has a way of weaving itself into lives. The noblewoman, Lady Marianne, carries hers into a household where power plays are played as quietly as chess. She keeps the mirror on a dressing table, its face veiled until needed. She is a woman who knows how to keep counsel, one who manages alliances by a tilt of eyebrow and a knowing gift. The mirror's arrival, intended to increase her standing, instead amplifies discord. One evening, as she prepares for a house visit from a neighbouring lady, Lady Marianne unmasks the glass to adjust her veil. In the mirror, she glimpses not only her own features, but the faint blur of a child's face behind her, a child she and her husband had lost years ago. The sight unmans her for a moment. She collapses into a chair with a sudden emptiness that feels like grief given a new shape. Her maid sees the collapse and brings the priest. From then on, Marianne hides the mirror from her husband and tells no one of the image that invaded her reflection. Yet the mirror's presence subtly changes how she moves in her house. It becomes a private thing of sorrow rather than a display of status. Stories of such private reflections multiply, and their aggregate effect is social. Objects carry reputations now as much as prices. The mirror, small, cheap, modern in a way, becomes a node through which relationships pass, a gift, a secret, a cause of suspicion. It is as though every time a mirror is moved, Lady Marianne unmasks the glass to adjust her veil. In the mirror, she glimpses not only her own features, but the faint blur of a child's face behind her, a child she and her husband had lost years ago. The sight unmans her for a moment. She collapses into a chair with a sudden emptiness that feels like grief given a new shape. Her maid sees the collapse and brings the priest. From then on, Marianne hides the mirror from her husband and tells no one of the image that invaded her reflection. Yet the mirror's presence subtly changes how she moves in her house. It becomes a private thing of sorrow rather than a display of status. Stories of such private reflections multiply, and their aggregate effect is social. Objects carry reputations now as much as prices. The mirror, small, cheap, modern in a way, becomes a node through which relationships pass, a gift, a secret, a cause of suspicion. It is as though every time a mirror is moved, a little of the invisible world strains to enter the visible one. People notice these shifts, and they adjust. Some cannot stand the strain and smash the glass. Others, like Lady Marianne, keep the secret and live under its weight. Not all stories end in sorrow. In a different household, a healer named Alia uses a small, simple mirror to teach a young apprentice how to lay hands on a fever. She instructs him to look at the face reflected, not for vanity, but to observe the eyes, the tinge of colour, the way the lips purse. Together they diagnose a child's illness and administer herbs. The child recovers Alia's mirror, then becomes for her a narrow, precise instrument of care. Her neighbours respect her trade, and in time, the mirror loses its edge of suspicion in that particular lane of the village. Utility tempers fear, practical success bends superstition into usefulness, at least locally. So the mirror's meaning is not singular, it depends on use and narrative. A few careful successes are not enough to overturn the stories that grip the wider imagination. Though when an ill fortune or a strange vision is reported, the mirror tends to be called to account. A woman accused of bewitching a neighbour's cow is found to have a mirror in her cottage. The neighbour swears that after the woman sat before the glass and murmured strange words, the cow fell ill. The case goes to the local court. Testimony is a precarious thing. Witnesses recall a woman holding a mirror. Words like sitting and murmuring gather force. The defendant insists she used the mirror for making sure the straps on her bridle were correctly fastened. The judge is a stern man named Master Corbin, who respects law and hears charms as either foolish habit or malicious intent, depending on the mood of the hour. He dissects testimony as if he were cutting meat, who said what and when, and what proof exists beyond rumor. The mirror on the stool becomes a piece of contested evidence, an ordinary object turned into a signpost for guilt or innocence. We should also remember the aesthetic metamorphoses mirrors inspired. Craftsmen began to decorate frames with motifs that addressed anxieties, a carved saint, a tiny cross inscriptions, asking for protection. These embellishments were not mere ornamentation, they were cultural reassurances. A frame that invoked a saint or bore a prayer was signaling that the mirror was not an ungodly device, but a tool under divine supervision. Such adaptations served both practical and ideological functions. They made the mirror saleable to devout buyers, and they softened the mirror's uncanny power by embedding it in a network of sacred signs. The interplay of commerce and ritual is crucial. As trade networks expanded, as the portable luxury economy grew, so did the market for reassuring paraphernalia. Mirrors became objects that could be domesticated by ritual. Think of a mirror wrapped in linen, blessed by a priest, and then stored on a shelf. The blessing, an institutional act, converts the object from a potentially dangerous portal into a sanctioned instrument. This is part of how the church and the marketplace negotiated their boundaries. Practical items could be folded into pious habits. The church did not always resist the worldly, often it baptized it. Monasteries sold relics and indulgences. They also permitted certain goods, when these goods served community functions. The mirror's story also intersects with changing technologies in ways that prefigure modern anxieties about images. As mirrors became clearer, as painted portraits grew more lifelike, people began to wonder what it meant to have so many reproductions of faces circulating. Portrait miniatures, too, could be portable images that families carried and used in courtship, in mourning, and in diplomacy. A miniature portrait might be exchanged as a token. A mirror might show that portrait to you, reflecting back a layered image of identity. In all these exchanges, image proliferated, and proliferation can both comfort and destabilize. More images meant more ways to be seen and judged. For someone in a small town whose face already represented family honor, the sudden possibility of multiple circulating likenesses could be unsettling. There are also darker legal threads to pull. In some court records, a mirror is offered as proof of a crime. Someone claims to have seen a person's face in a mirror at the time of an event, and thus identifies a suspect. In other instances, a person's possession of a mirror is treated as incriminating. The logic is not purely rational. It is cultural. It rests on shared anxieties. Yet cultural logic is not trivial. It moves judges, crowds, and families. A woman accused of witchcraft might face a jury whose members have a lifetime of stories about mirrors, their alignment with sorcery, their role in tempting saints, their appearance in ghostly visions. Against such a background, it is difficult to imagine the possibility of a fair hearing. And then there is the intimate domestic drama that mirrors could catalyze: jealousies, secrets, and the discovery of unfaithfulness. A husband might notice his wife spending extra hours before the glass and suspect infidelity. A wife might catch sight of another woman's reflection in a mirror and see confirmation of a rival's beauty. Mirrors could be instruments in personal narratives of betrayal, possessions in which human emotion coalesced into suspicion. These private dramas have public consequences: duels, challenges, social ostracism. The mirror sits at the center, its surface a simple stage that magnifies the stakes of ordinary human drama. Yet, in the longer sweep, a curious thing happens. The repeated exposure to mirrored images encourages new kinds of self-conception. People begin, slowly and intermittently, to learn the language of appearance as a skill. Courtesans learn to play to the glass. Artisans perfect the techniques of representing human likeness in static images. Even for those who still fear mirrors in certain contexts, their presence trains people to a higher visual literacy. This literacy inevitably shapes thought. Seeing oneself as a discrete image fosters a conception of the self that is more individuated. This shift does not happen uniformly, nor quickly. It is an accretion of practice, trade, status, and artistic habit. But it is important because it shows how the same object that sparks terror can, over generations, scaffold a different way of understanding personhood. Think, too, of the symbolic economy surrounding mirrors in literature. Poets and moralists continue to use mirror imagery to explore the tension between inner virtue and outer appearance. A poem that compares the soul to a polished mirror is quietly subversive of mirror fear. It suggests that reflection, when rightly ordered, is a virtue. In the meditative rooms of the monasteries, the image may be used to teach the friar to empty himself, so that God's light may be reflected. This positive theological use of mirror language again complicates the simple narrative of dread. It is not that medieval people unanimously feared mirrors. They feared certain uses and certain contexts. They revered other kinds of reflection, especially when framed within devotional practice. Still, the moments that capture our attention are often the ones where things go awry. Consider the episode in a small town where a mirror is brought to arbitration. The dispute is over a dowry. A piece of silver ringed with glass was promised, and in the exchange the bride's family claims the mirror was swapped for a lesser object. The groom's family insists the mirror is authentic. The case takes on an air of cosmic import because the mirror has been used. Meanwhile, in both households, to maintain appearances of prosperity, the town gathers to see which family will be shamed. The judge examines the mirror, feels its weight, inspects the maker's mark, and ultimately rules in favor of the bride's family, because the object's provenance and quality match their claim. The mirror, in this instance, is both object and arbiter. Its presence decides honor and settles the social ledger. That functional use stabilizes the object in the civic order, even as it carries its cultural overtones. But then, sometimes, the mirror refuses to be a neutral instrument. A case is recorded in which a guild of glassmakers faces accusations that their mirrors are made with black magic because a series of patrons suffered misfortunes after acquisition. The guild, proud and practical, offers a demonstration. In a crowded square they will show the processes, the fire, the mixture of sand and ash, the use of tin and mercury to back the glass. The artisans lift up mirrors and show how light behaves, how soot can cloud the silvering. They invite the crowd to observe, to touch, to understand. The demonstration is a modest success. Some villagers accept the rational explanation, others remain wary. The guild is forced to adapt. It begins to affix religious symbols and to solicit clerical blessings for its wares. This mixture of demonstration and ecclesiastical negotiation is typical. Technical expertise must often be validated by cultural authority if it is to thrive. The mirror that began in Aldo's chest moves through such negotiations like a traveler worn by experience. It will find moments of sanctification and moments of scandal. It will be an object of practical use and an object of obsession. It will be both a tool for a midwife's careful work and to others a possible repository for malefice. This ambivalence, this capacity to be both healing and harmful, is central to understanding why medieval people could fear mirrors so deeply. It is not that mirrors were magically dangerous in themselves. It is that they became points where a culture's deepest anxieties about seeing, selfhood, and boundary were focused. Let me bring you back to Aldo for a moment. He has moved on from the market and has begun to notice a sequence of events that seem to him merely coincidental until they knit into pattern. The buyer who took the expensive mirror returns after a fortnight, pale and uneasy, claiming to have seen in the glass a vision of a storm at sea that never came. Another buyer's child falls short of fever weeks after the mirror is brought into the home. Aldo's ledger does not account for such things, and so he begins to regard the mirror with a trader's skepticism. Either the object is cursed, or people are finding stories in the ordinary, and turning accident into omen. He begins to inquire quietly to the people who have bought mirrors from him, asking whether anything peculiar has happened. Some laugh at him and attribute his question to the merchant's superstition. Others confess, embarrassed, that they too noticed strange reflections. The pattern becomes a kind of social contagion when someone reports an odd sight. Others remember similar things, and the narrative grows. Also, practical but not immune to fear, decides to take a precaution. He brings a small cross and has the local priest bless the remaining mirrors. He pays the priest with a modest sum and a promise to bring more when business grows. The priest performs the blessing with a gravity that reduces the room's edge. A prayer, the sign made, the rubbing of holy water. The ritual is small, but it works because it slots the object back into a known theological and social order. Those blessed mirrors are now sanctioned instruments. The fear is leased out to the church, and in exchange people can buy with less worry. This interplay between commerce, religion, and fear is what ultimately shapes the mirror's fate in the medieval world. The more that institutions can assimilate an object, bless it, regulate it, incorporate it into law, the more that object can lose its most disruptive capacities. Yet there will always be anomalies, events that fall outside institutional frames and reawaken older, deeper stories. A mirror that shows a ghost, a child inexplicably struck by illness after catching her own reflection at midnight, a lord who sees a traitor's face where none exists. These are the tales that refuse neat resolution. They return us to the opening intuition that mirrors are not merely material goods, but nodes of existential meaning. As seasons change and trade patterns shift, as wars push through certain regions and bring with them new artisans and new stories, the mirror continues to evolve in the landscape of fear and familiarity. Its meaning is always negotiated anew. In some places, the looking glass becomes ordinary and loses its sting. In others, it remains an object of deep suspicion, a thing to be hidden or sanctified, depending on the hour and the household. We should not leave the subject without considering an even older layer, the symbolic resonance of mirror, like surfaces in pre-Christian and folk beliefs that persist into the medieval period. Before Venetian workshops and the church's glosses, people lived with the deep symbolic meaning of water, metal, and polished stones, surfaces that could capture and return an image. These materials were embedded in rites of divination and in the practice of watching for omens. In many folk traditions, elders used bowls of water to read the future, to watch for signs of returning spirits, or to calm the fevered brow of the sick. Such practices did not vanish with the advent of glass. They adapted, often grudgingly syncretized into Christian frameworks, and sometimes condemned outright. The persistence of these older customs helps explain why mirrors could be so unstable in meaning. They were folded into a tapestry of practices that predated modern notions of secular craft. And finally, consider the durability of mirror lore as a cultural product. Even as technologies change and mirrors become parts of more households, the stories remain. They pass down in whispers and in the margins of books. They survive in ceremony, covering mirrors during mourning, blessing them at christenings. They survive in the images artists paint, in the proverbs that caution against pride, in the jokes and the children's dares. The mirror is a small, portable thing, but its story is elastic. It bends to fit into many contexts, and picks up meanings along the way. In that sense, the medieval fear of mirrors teaches us something larger about how societies handle novelty, and how they integrate or exclude objects that threaten to reorder social life. And so the mirror that began its life under Aldo's careful hand becomes a lens through which a world fears, hopes, bargains, and loves. It reflects not only faces, but the social logic of its age, trade, faith, gender norms, medical practice, legal procedure. In reflecting, it does more than show. It does something like translate, converting the visual into social action. That translation is why the mirror could inspire dread. When a single artifact can set in motion gossip, prayer, accusations, and healing. When it can alter how people behave and think about themselves, it becomes dangerous precisely because it is consequential. We will follow other objects like this mirror and other hands that touch them, and in tracing them, we will meet people at the edges of belief. Skeptical merchants who learn to respect what they cannot explain, pious clerics who try to domesticate the new images, healers who turn reflection into care, and ordinary families who invent rituals that keep what is feared at bay. Each vignette will show how fear is not simply the result of ignorance, but is often a reasonable response to the kinds of social and existential risks that mirrors represented. Aldo's mirror will not be the last to unsettle. But before it reaches its next owner, a man named Thomas, who has his own soft-spoken fears, and a wife who prays often. There is one more strand to bind into our story, the symbolic power of broken glass. For many medieval people, a shattered mirror was not just a material loss, but a moral and social rupture. Breaking a mirror could be accidental, but it could also be intentional, a way to sever a bad omen, to release a trapped spirit, or to perform a kind of social excision. Shards of glass were sometimes buried, sometimes burned, sometimes kept as charms against future harm. The rituals surrounding broken mirrors reveal a culture that had to manage the fallout of its objects, not just their daily use. Picture, then, a different household where a mirror falls and shatters during a heated argument. The family interprets the breaking as an ill sign, a fracture in domestic harmony. They consult a local wise woman who tells them to gather the shards at dawn and bury them at the crossroads. This act, half practical and half symbolic, is meant to disperse the mirror's dark claim. The crossroads itself is a liminal space, apt for discarding things that blur boundaries. Such rituals, which blend the practical with the mythic, are commonplace in the medieval imagination. They show how people tried to reorient their world when objects betrayed their expectations. There is also the matter of inherited mirrors. When a mirror passes from parent to child, it carries baggage, family stories, a reputation of blessing or curse, the residue of prior owners' griefs. Families invest these objects with memory. An heirloom mirror can be an anchor of identity. A face and a family lineage return to view each morning. Yet the weight of memory can also render it suspect. If a mirror belonged to an ancestor who died young, or who was rumored to have consorted with the devil, the heirloom may be wrapped in cloth and only produced at weddings or funerals. The tension between continuity and rupture, keeping a family's trace visible and protecting present life from past scandal, plays itself out in the care and custody of mirrors. As festivals and fairs spread through the countryside, as itinerant craftsmen displayed their wares, the presence of mirrors in more homes creates a cultural feedback loop. The more people see reflective images, the more normalized they become. And yet some folkways persist as stubborn holdovers. The covering of mirrors during mourning, the cautious use of mirrors by pious people, the belief that certain mirrors are vessels for more than light. These practices can last for generations, embedded in households like old tiles. We are approaching a moment where mirror culture tips into a different register. The late medieval and early Renaissance artisans will perfect techniques that make mirrors more accessible, and that give artists new tools. Portraiture changes the nature of looking. Studios experiment with optical effects. Scholars begin to think about perception in ways that will become foundational for modern science. But that tipping point does not eliminate the medieval concerns we have been tracing. Instead, it reconfigures them. Old fears get translated into new anxieties about likeness, reproduction, and the commodification of images. As the mirror spreads, so does the need to manage it socially, and in the intimate details of ordinary people's lives. Aldo counting coins, Lady Marianne hiding sorrow, Alia teaching an apprentice. The mirror remains both a practical implement and a charged symbol. It is in these small moments that the medieval terror of mirrors becomes comprehensible, not as mere irrational fear, but as a set of practices and stories that make sense within a world where the visible and the invisible touch often, and where an object's reflection can mean life-altering things. We will continue to follow Aldo's mirror, and others like it, as they move through households, guilds, and courts. We will watch how rituals adapt, how laws respond, how art negotiates with fear, and how ordinary people find ways to live with something that both comforts and unsettles. We will meet more hands that touch these mirrors, hands of healers, of magistrates, of women who keep household order. And in their stories we will see the mirror's many faces, instrument, omen, evidence, charm, burden, and blessing. Follow with me now, as the mirrors spread outward from Aldo's market into a broader web of trade and belief. And as the responses to them multiply, we will witness a series of events that show the mirror's capacity to unnerve and to heal. And we will see how, in the complicated interplay of commerce, faith, gender, and law, medieval people learned to live alongside reflections, even as they sometimes feared what looked back. We pause here, at the doorway of the next town, where Thomas will lift the mirror from its crate, and where an argument about stewardship, secrecy, and devotion will begin to enfold those who own and who are owned by their reflections. The cobbles hum beneath the cart. The market bell tolls in the distance. The chest is opened again, and a hand reaches for the glazed surface. The story goes on. The chest is opened again, and a hand reaches for the glazed surface. The hand belongs to Thomas, a quiet man who tends to his small household with a gentle industriousness. He has weathered cheeks, patient hands, and a wife, Elsbeth, who wakes before dawn to spin. Thomas is the sort of person who measures risk in routine and believes superstition useful, only insofar as it keeps children from wandering into bogs. He lifts the mirror and feels, for a heartbeat, the same odd tightness Aldo felt, the sensation that the object is heavier with presence than its size warrants. He tells himself, this is simply merchant, craft, good backing, immaculate polish, and yet he notices the maker's mark, tiny and elegant, stamped into the metal on the mirror's back. It looks almost like a sigil. Elsbeth, who has never had the chance to look into such a clear glass at home, is pleased when Thomas sets the mirror on the dresser. She arranges her combs and lays out a neat linen kerchief, the routine of getting ready made almost ceremonial by the mirror's presence. For a week, the object becomes ordinary. They use it for trimming beards and pinning braids. They check teeth before the rare visit to the market. Friendly neighbours peep in, admire the glass, and gossip about how Thomas has done well for himself. Life resumes its soft rhythms, work, bread, child, rearing, until a small, almost insignificant event shifts the pattern. One evening, as storm drums roll in the sky, Elsbeth sits by the window with the mirror between her knees. The child's blanket, little Anna's, lies at her feet, and a candle guttering on the sill makes the room feel like a place apart from the world. She has been thinking of the midwife who first taught her certain remedies, of the long hours of labour she endured, of times when the household seemed held together by prayer and the thin thread of ordinary competence. As she lowers her eyes to the mirror, she catches a flicker, not of her face, but of the room behind her, the shadowed nook where an old chest sits, covered in moth-eaten cloth. In that little square of reflected room she sees the silhouette of a woman bent as if in grief. Startled, Elsbeth looks around, searches the actual room. There is nothing. The candlelight is steady. The sound of rain is steady. She blames fatigue, perhaps the pressure of years pressing on the mind. Instead, she folds it into the soft life of the household as a private perplexity. The next morning, Thomas notes a furrow in the road, tracks of a cart that had passed in the night. An itinerant storyteller has been in the village, and his tales of strange mirrors and coastal omens have made their way into the inn. The memory of Aldo's stall, the town bell, Brother Martin's warning, all the threads curl into a cautious weave. Thomas, despite himself, begins to watch the mirror during the quiet hours, half in curiosity, half to ensure that the household's boundaries remain intact. The mirror resists spectacle. It returns faithful, ordinary images, Thomas's hands, Elsbeth's braid, Anna asleep. Yet occasionally, in the edge light, it presents a shape that slips the ordinary frame and carries a feeling, loss, longing, distance. You can imagine how this small pattern worms into the larger social life. In a village where faces and reputations matter a great deal, any hint of something uncanny becomes talk. The baker mentions the household's new mirror. Someone else remembers an aunt who smashed a looking glass when her husband died. The local priest hears the rumor and stops by under the pretense of offering a blessing to a newborn. He performs the ritual with a hand that is mild but sure, a litany of words that smooth over the household's edges. The blessing is pragmatic. It reinscribes the mirror into a theology the house trusts, yet miracles and omens do not always yield to straightforward ritual. If the mirror holds an image, the image persists in memory as if with a life of its own. As these domestic oddities accumulate, they ripple outward. A neighbor borrowing a spoon is startled to find the mirror's edge catching on their skirt, and to see in the glass a figure whose face is not their own. Gossip, soft, insistent, works like netting, capturing attention and bending meaning. Some villagers shrug, others grow wary. 2 weeks after Thomas acquires the glass, the priest organizes a small procession through the lanes, carrying relics and praying for household protection. The act is both a spiritual practice and an act of social reassurance. To have public prayer performed over private objects is to declare that communal order still presides. The mirror's trajectory from possession to public concern is not unique. Many objects pass silently from hands to hearts. Only some become knots around which communities tie their anxieties. Mirrors, with their capacity to return likeness and to provoke identification, are predisposed to this knotting. They are small, portable, private, and yet they echo in the public square. That inherent tendency explains why every effort at domestication, blessings, seals, hiding, coexists with stories of singular peril. There are, across the countryside, other stories that bear a familial resemblance to Thomas and Elsbeth's. A midwife in a town farther north uses a mirror to examine a newborn's mouth and sees in the child's reflected face a slight bluish tinge not evident otherwise. The midwife's observation prompts a quick consultation, and the baby survives. In another place, a nobleman purchases a handsome mirror and grows convinced it helps him see betrayals. He begins to suspect his steward of thievery, and after a bitter confrontation sends the man away. Later, documents reveal the steward's innocence. In each narrative, the mirror acts not as a passive prop but as an accelerant. It catalyzes decisions, brings fears to the fore, or becomes a hinge on which events turn. Consider also the artisan's perspective, because the craftsmen who made mirrors were not merely technicians, but people who knew their craft was watched with curiosity and anxiety. Glassmakers, especially those associated with Venetian techniques, worked under guild rules and in workshops that were part laboratory and part temple of skill. The mixing of materials, lead, tin, quicksilver, and the heating of sand are processes that require both knowledge and tacit secrecy. For artisans, the mirror is an object of pride. To make a clear surface that returns an undistorted face is an achievement. They saw their work as a mix of science, craft, and a kind of humility before the laws of nature, yet they were not blind to public suspicion. Guilds sometimes employed theological language to frame their trade as honorable. They would seek licenses and protective charters, arguing that what they produced was essential for commerce, art, and medicine, not an occult instrument. Anecdotes from guild records reveal master glassmakers defending their trade, testifying in courts that their processes were mechanical, not mystical, explaining the chemistry of silvering, the influence of fire, the importance of cleanliness. In return for such explanations, communities often offered protections and regulations that ensured quality and punished charlatanry. This back and forth is revealing. It shows how the material practice of mirror making became a site where knowledge, claims were contested and negotiated in public fora. When suspicion threatened to overwhelm trade, transparency, of a sort, won out. Guilds invited inspection, offered communal demonstrations, and affixed marks that allowed buyers to trace provenance. These marks functioned like primitive trademarks, assurances against deception, and implicitly against sorcery. While guilds defended themselves, there were also itinerant practitioners, folk healers, cunning folk and seers, who used mirrors in explicit ritual ways. Their practices sat uneasily with established religion, and were often the targets of suspicion. A cunning woman might use a bowl of water, a polished mirror, or a polished blade to scry for lost cattle, or to divine the cause of a child's cough. These practices persisted because they worked in the simplest sense. They gave people counsel, hope, and practical leads. If a practitioner told a grieving family where to look for a missing cow, or how to stir an herb for a fever, these actions had social utility. But they also ran afoul of official doctrine. Where the church saw a risk of demonic interference, folk practitioners saw an ancestral art. The tension between institutional orthodoxy and vernacular practice is a theme that runs throughout the mirror's story. This tension surfaces dramatically in witch trials and inquisitions. Testimony often recorded how accused persons used reflective objects. In instances where confessions were extracted, under pressure, coercion, or torture, mirrors were implicated as tools of maleficence. A woman might be said to have rubbed a mirror with a certain compound, and then caused illness in a neighbor's pig. These accounts are sticky with the politics of fear. They reveal how interpersonal grievances, economic competition, and gendered power imbalances could be articulated through allegations of mirror-driven magic. In a society where state and ecclesiastical authorities sought to consolidate power, the accusation of witchcraft became a way to assert order. Objects like mirrors were then convenient symbols, small, visible, and loaded with prior associations. Yet, it is vital to remember that not every mirror led to persecution, and not every accusation was believed. Local magistrates often balanced rumor against evidence, and many communities found ways to live with mirrors without descending into hysteria. It is helpful to see the mirror as a mirror of society. It reflects back social anxieties and deep cultural logics, as much as it reflects faces. When a community experiences stress, plague, famine, conflict, objects that seem to concentrate uncertainty become more dangerous. Conversely, when a community is stable and prosperous, mirrors are more likely to be absorbed into ordinary life. A more subtle cultural effect of mirrors is in the realm of self-fashioning. As mirrors become more prevalent in late medieval households, people begin to cultivate certain skills of appearance, styling hair, arranging clothes, learning the small but important art of comportment. In this way, mirrors are implicated in the emergence of a self-conscious about presentation. This is not merely vanity's triumph, it is also the rise of social technologies for managing relationships. A noble's public appearance can have political consequences. A merchant's neat dress may influence whether a buyer extends credit. The mirror, modest and domestic, participates in the formation of polite behavior. Bodies and faces become surfaces upon which social scripts are written. This cultural shift is visible in manuals and etiquette books that begin to appear. They advise on posture, on the modest display of jewelry, on the appropriate use of a mirror. These texts respond to a changing visual economy where appearances accumulate value. They serve as practical guides and also as moral corrections. The modern reader finds in them equal parts civility and counsel. A manual might advise a young woman to avoid lingering before a mirror lest she tempt vanity, while also instructing her in the proper placement of a kerchief. The mirror becomes in these texts both a hazard and a necessary apparatus for being in the world. Our story threads now wind towards a household where such social technologies will cause a ripple. Thomas and Elsbeth's mirror, after weeks of ordinary use and small inquietudes, attracts the attention of a visiting apprentice, a scribe whose curiosity knows little of committee or caution. He watches the way Elsbeth arranges her hair and the way Thomas runs a hand absently along the frame. He borrows the mirror on a pretext and takes it to study the way light bends in its face. Alone, he notices, in the reflection's periphery, a small inscription on the frame's inner lip that had remained hidden. It is a word, faint, and in a script that suggests a maker's prayer or invocation. The apprentice is thrilled. Here is proof of a maker's hand, of a history written into wood and metal. He shows it to no one at first, savouring his small discovery. Yet this is the kind of secret that will not remain secret. He mentions the inscription to a friend in the guild, and the friend frowns, tracing the letters with a forefinger of suspicion. The letters are not the usual shop mark. They seem perhaps foreign, perhaps older. Rumours begin to circulate that the mirror was not merely a merchant's item, but perhaps connected to some artisanal guild with ties to distant places. The speculation is benign at first, but speculation is the engine of rumour. The more people talk, the more the mirror accrues significance beyond its weight. News reaches Brother Martin, who has more than a passing interest in objects that stir communal anxieties. He writes a clipped note to the bishop, describing the pattern of mirrors and their appearances in nearby towns. He frames his concern in theological terms, that images might serve idolatry, that objects can become false gods in private devotion. The bishop, a man who values order and fears the fracturing of ecclesiastical authority, asks for a careful response. He orders that certain mirrors be collected for inspection. The edict moves slowly. News is slower yet. Meanwhile, Thomas and Elsbeth hold their domestic life under the small tension of being watched. This is important because it shows how local curiosities can scale into institutional action. Objects that began in private can, through rumour and concern, enter the realm of authority. The mirror that was once a means to adjust a braid can become testimony in an inquiry about the moral economy of images. When institutions get involved, new modes of evaluation are applied. Theological criteria, legal standards, and practical demonstrations of manufacture. These modes sometimes pacify public fear, and sometimes inflame it. The inquisitorial procedure, where it occurs, offers one of the sharpest lenses into how fear and governance intertwined with mirrors. Did a person deliberately aim to harm through an object, or did natural causes explain misfortune? Testimony matters immensely, but so does context. Who benefits from an accusation? What prior animosities exist? And how will a verdict serve broader social aims? In many cases, the inquisitor's job is less to prove supernatural causation than to restore civic harmony. Burning an accused witch might eliminate a source of fear, but it may also exacerbate social fractures. Thus, the mirror is implicated not simply in episodes of alleged magic, but in a complex system of social management. At the same time, the mirror functions in devotional life in transformative ways. For some contemplative traditions, reflection is not an object of scorn, but of spiritual discipline. A polished interior mirror, the metaphorical, not the glass one, becomes a way to reflect divine light. Mystical writers describe the purified heart as a mirror that reveals God. This language yields a reappropriation of reflective metaphors, rather than fear the reflecting surface. The faithful are enjoined to cultivate an inner clarity. Such spiritual schools do not dispel popular fear. They offer a parallel narrative where the discipline of self-examination is a pathway to sanctity. The coexistence of these narratives, fearful and devotional, constitutes the medieval mirror's richest context. As the mirror moves through more hands and more contexts, its life becomes a palimpsest of practices. In workshops it is a product and proof of skill. In homes it is a tool and a possible threat. In courts it is evidence and a symbol. In rituals it is blessed or buried. Each new inscription, each new handling, writes another layer of meaning. That is why a single mirror can be implicated in so many stories. It is not merely an object, but a node in a network of social relations that spans commerce, gender, religion, art, and law. Back in Thomas's household, the mirror's slow accumulation of layers yields a decisive moment. One night, a traveller arrives at the village, a woman wrapped in a cloak, grey-eyed, smooth-handed for someone on the road. She stops at the inn and hears the rumour of the household mirror. She requests lodging in their house. No small favour in a small community. Elsbeth, whose hospitable instincts are strong, invites her in. The woman's presence is quiet and unobtrusive. She helps in the kitchen and moves through the house like someone familiar with the soft liturgies of domestic life. Yet when she bathes, she is careful not to look into the mirror. That reticence intrigues Elsbeth. In private confession one evening, the traveller reveals herself to be a pilgrim on her way to a shrine, and offers a small tale that in her home region, mirrors are treated with certain customs, covered for births, silent in funerals, and carried on journeys only with prayers. She tells of a grandmother who swore that silvered glass collects the sighs of ancestors, and that one must always speak a blessing over any reflective plane one keeps. This simple act of storytelling transforms the household's relationship to the mirror anew. The pilgrim's words are a bridge to older customs, to the long memory of practice that crosses borders and generations. The presence of someone who treats mirrors with a ritualized grace gives Thomas and Elsbeth permission to reframe their own usage. They begin to wrap the mirror in linen when a funeral passes, to anoint its frame when a child is baptized, and to keep it under a cloth when not needed. These rituals do not erase all anxiety, but they place the object back into a network of meaning where community, rite, and family provide a buffer. The pilgrim departs with a blessing, and the household, reorganized, finds a fragile peace. Stories like this demonstrate the resilience of practices. A culture need not choose between complete rationalization and total superstition. It often inhabits both. Practical ritualization, wrapping a mirror, blessing it, burying shards, are ways of domestication that preserve utility while recognizing risk. In that sense, medieval people were adept cultural managers, inventing social and religious technologies to live with the objects that both aided and unsettled them. Yet the narrative tension remains. For other houses, the mirror's presence precipitates dramatic clashes. A jealous husband sues, a neighbor accuses, a guild inspects, a priest warns. In these moments, the mirror is a catalyst for the most human of dramas, the struggle over trust, honor, and legitimacy. The mirror stands at the intersection of interiority and social display, and because interiority was viewed as morally freighted in medieval thinking, the mirror could never be wholly neutral. What it reflected mattered tremendously. We will follow some of those dramatic arcs as we continue. Stories where mirrors catalyze confrontations in courts, where artisans defend their trade from accusations of witchcraft, where women, midwives, and healers navigate perilous reputations while using mirrors as tools of care. We will see how towns and guilds institutionalize protections, and how rituals adapt to absorb new goods. In doing so, we will meet characters whose lives are transformed by a small reflective plane, a magistrate who must rule in a messy dispute, a healer who faces an accusation she cannot explain away, a widow who finds in a mirror a rekindling of memory she would rather forget. Each of these lives illuminates the broader cultural logic that made mirrors objects of both practical necessity and existential dread. Hold this image in mind as we move forward. The mirror as an active participant in life, quietly altering interactions through its mere presence. That is the key to understanding the medieval terror of mirrors. It is not a superstition that lives in a vacuum. It is a pattern of social reasoning that maps onto the everyday needs and fears of people who had to manage threats both visible and invisible. Mirrors, by reflecting faces and provoking thought about identity, compelled people to reckon with who they were and what they believed, and therein lay their peril. Now, imagine the moment when the guildmaster returns to the town, summoned discreetly after the pilgrim's story circulates, and requests to examine the mirror's maker's mark. He flips it open with practiced fingers, cleans the back with a strip of cloth, and reveals letters that suggest a maker's lineage across regions, an itinerant glasswork whose name is whispered in markets from the coast to the inland fairs. The guildmaster turns the mirror and studies the grain of the frame. He murmurs that the mark suggests quality, but also a craft practiced by those who often move between jurisdictions, makers who are sometimes outside the protective embrace of municipal regulation. The implication is subtle. An object that crosses borders is harder to integrate into legal and moral regimes. Borderless objects are always hard to domesticate. They arrive with foreign logics, with techniques and rituals that do not map easily onto local customs. That the mirror's maker may have moved from place to place adds a layer of cosmopolitan risk to a parochial world. People fear the foreign not only for its difference, but because difference makes prediction difficult. The guildmaster's concern, therefore, is both economic and moral. He wishes to ensure the authenticity of the product and to preserve community order from the destabilizing potential of unregulated artisans. As night gathers and the town sleeps, the mirror sits on Tomas's dresser, wrapped in linen and blessed, a small, potent secret in a house that has rearranged itself around it. The pilgrim has gone on, the guildmaster has left for consultations, and the village returns to its rhythms. Yet the mirror's life is only beginning. It will pass from household to household, be involved in court disputes, be used by a healer for a delicate operation, be destroyed in a fit of rage, and be buried at a crossroads. Each of those acts will be an episode in the mirror's biography, each a small event that illuminates the ways medieval people responded to the presence of images in a world that was at once vividly visual and profoundly spiritual. We will continue on that path, following the mirror and others like it as they shape lives and prompt rituals. Along the way, we will meet the magistrate who tries to adjudicate a theft charge where a mirror is the only piece of evidence, the healer who must defend her use of a reflective bowl in a court of law, and the families that hide mirrors under cloth at midnight to protect their children. These vignettes will show how cultural practices, legal norms and personal fears braided together around small, shiny things, producing a medieval mirror law that is as complex as it is human. Listen as the road ahead narrows and winds toward a market town where a dispute will escalate into a public trial. Imagine the court's smell, leather, smoke, ink, the way voices gather there like flocks at dusk. Imagine the mirror brought forward, placed on a rough table for all to see, and imagine how that small reflective plane will command attention, shaping testimony and conviction in ways that only a society invested in images could. The case will test social relations, the authority of guilds over their craft, and the legal system's capacity to manage objects that blur the line between the natural and the uncanny. We will step into that court next, to listen to the voices around the mirror. The accused, the accusers, the artisan, the priest, and the magistrate with his ledger and scales. The mirror will, once again, act as a catalyst, and through the courtroom's deliberation, we will see the medieval mind arranging its laws around image and object, carving out procedures for evidence, and wrestling with the same question that has haunted the centuries. When an object can change how people act, can it be held morally or legally culpable? The question is not merely philosophical, it is intensely practical, and its answer will reveal much about how early societies balanced belief, commerce, and authority. The court is a low, vaulted room, its beams darkened by smoke and age, and the smell of wax and ink hangs like a quiet fog. People gather on benches, their faces lantern, lit and expectant. In the center, on a rough wooden table, rests the mirror. It is wrapped still in linen, but the fabric has been drawn back, so the glass shows a modest, honest face of whoever leans over it. No grand trompe, low ale, just the room and the people, as if the mirror were a small, impartial witness. In this culture, often carry more testimony than their owners would admit. The case at hand is deceptively simple: a theft from a merchant's stall. A mirror, according to the complainant, was taken during the bustle of market day and later discovered in the home of a neighbour, Maud the weaver. The merchant claims loss, Maud claims innocence. The mirror, it turns out, had been seen in transit from Aldo's chest, sold in the market, and for reasons that will become entangled, borrowed and lent in ways that make ownership messy. Somebody, perhaps in a moment of vanity, or perhaps in a moment of helpless need, brought the mirror home. When the merchant demanded recompense, Maud refused, saying the mirror was a gift. The merchant countered that he had no record of such a gift. Neighbors' testimonies do not agree. The matter grows, as such things do, into a legal tangle. The magistrate, a man named Master Corbin, takes a long moment to inspect the mirror. He is an exacting official, more used to disputes over land than over small wares. But he understands the principle. Property disputes reveal social patterns and must be resolved with a balance of precision and wisdom. He looks at the maker's mark. He asks Maud where she received the mirror. He asks the merchant to state the time and circumstances of sale. Witnesses chatter. A woman who brushes wool against her chin remembers seeing the mirror on the stall. A boy remembers Maud admiring a shine in the market. A man recalls a transaction that might have involved a borrowed coin. The threads do not line up neatly. Then the matter sharpens. A neighbor testifies that Maud was seen at night speaking to the mirror in a low voice. The phrase cuts across the room like a cold wind head's turn. Conversations that had been about ownership pivot swiftly toward a darker register. Was she mere chatter? A private habit? Or was she performing something more sinister? An invocation, a manipulation, a conjuring. The declaration tends to snowball, for in a culture where reflective planes are associated with scrying and sorcery, the sight of someone speaking to a mirror Willie nearly clamps down into meaning. Maud, for her part, is bewildered. She says she spoke to the mirror because she had been thinking of a daughter long dead, because she sometimes tells household objects the day's news, because talking to things is a way people share grief when their neighbors' gossip will not. Her words are ordinary, domestic, fragile, but the court is not merely a place of facts. It is a theatre of belief. The magistrate hears her and knows that in adjudicating this matter, he must also adjudicate fear. If he dismisses the neighbor's testimony too lightly, he risks failing the community's anxieties. If he gives it too much weight, he could ruin an innocent woman's life. The balance is delicate and exacting. Master Corbin calls in a craftsman from the guild to examine the mirror's provenance. The guildmaster, a stern man named Gerard, inspects the frame and lifts the glass to the light. He points out hallmarks and the subtle way the silvering was applied, the tiny pinholes where copper soldered frames together. He explains to the court the process of silvering, the traces of certain alloys, the distinctive handwriting of a maker from the coast. His testimony carries authority. It is a practical knowledge that is hard to refute, but it does not answer the neighbor's accusation about Maud's nocturnal habits. Practical truth and social meaning sit in different registers here. The magistrate seeks compromise. Perhaps the mirror was borrowed, perhaps the gift was misremembered, perhaps the neighbor's remark was ill-placed gossip. He asks for restitutions, for pledges, for promises to behave. But a faction in the court insists on a more probing test. They propose that the mirror be used in a small test, let Maud be asked questions, and let the mirror be placed before her. If she refuses to look, it will be taken as proof of something. The procedure is crude, and yet it reveals how material objects can dictate process. People think they can force an object to produce truth. They forget that the object, like a mirror, simply returns what is put before it. Maud, frightened and weary, agrees to the test, because it seems the only way to bring this quarrel to rest. She stands before the glass and looks at herself, at her hands calloused by weaving, at the line of a mouth that has tasted both bread and bitter news. The mirror reflects nothing but a human face. For a time, the court is silent as if the common breath were held. A small child at the back begins to hum under his breath to break the tension. A woman mutters a prayer. The presence of the mirror in the judicial space sharpens the senses. The body is on trial even as the property is. After the test, Master Corbin adjudicates in a way that reveals the court's priorities. He rules that the mirror must be restored to the merchant if he can prove ownership by payment or witnesses, but he also recognizes Maud's presence of mind in a house where objects are shared across kinship networks. He orders a relative to vouch for a partial repayment. He also instructs the local priest to speak on charity and neighborliness in the forthcoming sermon. Power thus flows in multiple directions. The law decides a property claim while also reasserting social norms and deploying the church's moral authority to mend communal bonds. The mirror is neither demonized nor wholly exonerated. It becomes instead a spoke in the wheel of community governance. This episode illustrates something essential about medieval life. Objects like mirrors could not easily be disentangled from the social fabric. They were embedded in networks of exchange, memory, ceremony, accusation, and care. A society's relationship to an object is rarely a matter of mere materiality. It is a web of use, story, and power. That web is what made mirrors simultaneously useful and dangerous. Beyond courts and households, mirrors also pushed at the boundaries of theological thought. Scholastic theologians and monastic writers debated the ontology of images. What is a likeness? Are images mere signs pointing beyond themselves, or do they possess some power to affect the world? These debates mattered because they shaped how communities and institutions regulated images. A subtle shift in theological language could mean the difference between a mirror being treated as a devotional metaphor and being feared as a possible instrument of demonic influence. Scholars wrote with the patience of glacial thought, parsing categories and privileging distinctions. Some argued that images, when rightly ordered, are didactic. They point the believer toward God, and thus are morally neutral or even positive. Others, influenced by suspicious histories or wary of idolatry, urged caution and stricter regulation. These debates took place in rooms filled with candles and marginalia, in the margins of texts where scribes doodled faces and iconographic metaphors. The theoretical refinement was far from the everyday fear of the villager, but it mattered because it shaped the language officials used when addressing rumor and law. As courts and monasteries grappled with mirrors, so too did artisans and artists. Painters, in particular, engaged with reflection as a compositional device. A mirror in a painting could reveal hidden scenes or double a subject's view, creating layers of meaning that invite contemplation. For viewers, seeing a painted mirror was an invitation to think about seeing itself, who looks, who is looked at, and what is reflected back. Artists delighted in such puzzles. Their work fed the cultural conversation about mirrors by presenting images that were, in effect, reflections on reflective devices. These images did not always resolve fear. They amplified it by making seeing more complex. There were also economic dimensions to a growing mirror culture. As demand rose, so did specialization. Some towns developed reputations for fine glass, others for intricate frames. Trade routes adjusted to carry mirrors alongside spices, cloth, and coin. With increased production came the need for regulation, for quality control, and for guild oversight. The economic importance of mirrors thus pushed them out of purely symbolic registers and into the practical realm of commerce and craft. Yet economic value never entirely displaces symbolic weight. People's willingness to pay more for a blessed or exquisitely worked mirror shows how spiritual and social capital attach to material goods. In the midst of these larger structures, individual stories continue to carry the most human resonance. A widow who keeps a small mirror on her mantle because it was her husband's last gift learns, slowly, to look at the face it reflects and to find in those mundane lines and creases the contours of grief and resilience. A scribe uses a tiny disc to check the alignment of letters when illuminating a manuscript, and in doing so, gives the object a quiet dignity. A child in a distant village uses a shard of mirror to catch the sun and make fire with a delighted gasp. These moments are tender and practical. They show how objects are folded into the texture of life. But for other people, mirrors catalyze crisis. A healer called Healer, for instance, is summoned to examine a child whose breath is shallow and whose face takes on strange hues. She uses a small, polished bowl to look into the infant's eyes. There, she claims, she sees a reflection that suggests a blocked bile, a malady that might be treated with a particular herb. She prescribes it, the child recovers. Healer's reputation grows, and with it whispers. Critics suggest she may be conjuring spirits. Friends defend her as a woman of skill. Healer's life becomes a balancing act between community need and suspicion, and the mirror, small and utilitarian, lies at the center of a social negotiation about expertise, trust and gender. Gender indeed is a recurrent thread in mirror lore. Women are both frequent users of mirrors for grooming and household management, and also frequent targets of accusations regarding mirrors' sinister potential. This asymmetry is not simple or absolute. Men use mirrors too, and men too are accused at times, but patterns of gendered suspicion exist. In societies where women's roles are circumscribed, and where their private spheres are laden with influence over childbirth, nursing, and household rituals, mirrors become sites where women's agency is both performed and judged. A woman who uses a mirror to improve her appearance may be accused of vanity. A woman who uses a mirror to diagnose an ailment may be accused of witchcraft. The mirror becomes a cipher for anxieties about female authority and independence. Across these domestic dramas and ecclesiastical debates, the mirror continues to be an object that invites ritual innovation. People devise practices to harness mirrors' benefits while mitigating their risks. A family may decide that mirrors are to be used only in daylight. Another may keep them in chests during sleep. In some regions, mirrors are wrapped in white cloth during periods of mourning, and in others, a small cross may be carved into the frame as a protective sign. The diversity of practice shows creativity and pragmatism. The mirror is too useful to be abandoned entirely, but the fear surrounding it is too deep to be ignored. There are also more theatrical responses. Street performers use small mirrors to create tricks, making faces appear doubled or splitting images to create illusions. Such spectacles delight audiences who, in a safe context, enjoy being fooled by reflection. These public entertainments provide a pressure valve for more serious anxieties. They normalize the experience of being deceived by vision in controlled, playful ways. They show that once fear is domesticated by performance, people can sometimes convert anxiety into amusement. Yet the allure of the mysterious persists. In remote hamlets, folk tales of mirrors that devour souls linger. In certain crafts, the recipe for silvering remains a guarded secret, and in certain hands, the making of a mirror is bound up with guild politics and municipal authority. In legal records, accusations flare and die, and in private, people continue to tuck mirrors under linen when the weather seems changing. These practices are not relics but living habits, practical responses to the kinds of uncertainty human life always contains. Our mirror, which began under Aldo's hand, and moved through so many lives, will find itself implicated in a different sort of story. Now, the story of a marriage. A merchant named Simon purchases the mirror to give to his bride on their wedding day. He thinks of it as a practical luxury, a fine object that will signal his position and taste. At the wedding, the mirror is placed upon the bride's dressing table, a gleam among the linens. For several weeks, the newlyweds enjoy the mirror's presence. It helps them arrange their clothes and check the tightness of a doublet or the drape of a gown. But then the couple's relationship changes subtly. Simon begins to suspect his bride's attentions. He notices a slight delay when she looks into the mirror before meeting his gaze. In a fraying economy of trust, the mirror becomes a focus for jealousy. Simon accuses. The argument grows. The mirror's presence does not cause the mistrust, but becomes an instrument in its expression. In this way, the mirror often functions as a third party in domestic disputes, amplifying what is already present. A different family preserves the mirror as an heirloom, passing it from mother to daughter, each generation wrapping it with a cloth and an admonition. Remember to bless it on your first child's naming day. The object accrues a lineage of rituals and admonishments, becoming a kind of moral book in itself. The mirror has become, over time, both a material lineage and a moral training device. Be modest, be vigilant, be loving. The object is now a teacher as much as it is a tool. As time goes on and mirrors become more common, societies adapt in more systematic ways. Some towns create specific ordinances about the sale of polished glass, regulating its weight, backing, and hallmarking techniques. Municipal authorities understand that a regulated market reduces disputes and gossip. The law begins to codify behavior around objects that once flew under the radar. Yet, regulation is always partial. The human appetite for meaning, for mystery, and for story finds ways around the most careful statutes. People invent new rituals, and the mirror remains a liminal object that will never entirely fit into neat categories. It is practical, and it is symbolic. It offers evidence and becomes rumor. It brings comfort and causes terror. The variability of human experience, grief, joy, jealousy, piety, will always find in a mirror a suitable instrument. Think now of an illuminated manuscript where a mirror appears in a marginal drawing. An artist paints a small woman peering into a reflective bowl. In the miniature, angels hover and whisper. The image is not condemnation so much as meditation. It invites the reader to reflect upon reflection itself. It asks whether what we see is an illusion or a revelation. This ambiguity is what makes the mirror such a potent cultural object. And so our story moves slowly toward another event where the mirror's presence will matter, not merely in a household or a court, but in the public theatre of confession and penitence. A village struck by sickness will look for signs and culprits. Fingers will point, objects will be seized. The mirror may be taken as an instrument of accusation, or used as a tool in the process of healing. The outcome will hinge on the community's shared commitments, its willingness to accept argument and to re-establish trust, or its readiness to seek redress through punishment. The mirror, small and reflective, will help determine which path the community takes. We will accompany that episode, which will reveal how contagion of rumor and the need for communal redress can transform an object into a symbol of social crisis. We will see how leaders, both lay and clerical, martial rituals and laws to reassert order, and how ordinary people, anxious and loving, make small compromises to restore peace. The mirror will be at the heart of this process, and through it we will glimpse how medieval societies negotiated the borderlands of the visible and invisible. For now, picture the people in the court dispersing, the mirror wrapped and carried back to the household, and the lessons learned that material objects hold a power that is not exclusively magical, but is socially constructed, that fear is an instrument and a signal, and that rituals, blessings, coverings, burials are ways communities manage what they cannot fully control. These are the human responses that undergird the medieval terror of mirrors, not merely the fear of images themselves, but the fear of what images can catalyze in human memory and action. We will continue with that village's sixth season, the accusations it precipitates, and the way a small mirror becomes the fulcrum of a communal decision. Along the way, we will meet more people, midwives, magistrates, skeptics, devotees, and witness how their lives bend and sometimes break on the small question of what it means to see and to be seen. The village's sixth season arrives as autumn leans toward winter, the air growing thinner and the hedgerows shedding their orange finery. Illness moves through households like an uninvited guest, mounting slowly at first, a cough in the morning, a fever by night, and then, if it finds its way into crowded rooms and poorly ventilated barns, gathering momentum. People lean on one another in such times, making small trades of food and advice, conjuring remedies that fit into pockets of tradition, and sometimes into the margin of formal medicine. But sickness also stokes fear, and fear breeds questions about causation. When death walks closely enough, suspicion seeks a shape. In this village, the first serious case is a child, a boy named Jory, who slips in the night into a cold, thin breathing. Hila, the healer we met earlier, is called in. She arrives with a small bag of herbs and a palpating hand, a woman whose work has been equal parts plant lore and practical compassion. She examines Jory by candlelight, looks at the child's tongue, listens to his breath, and speaks softly to the parents about poultices and warmth. She does not use mirrors often, preferring the feel of a pulse to the sight of a reflection. But she keeps a small, polished bowl among her tools, handy for checking the light in an eye, or for catching the way the skin seems to stretch around a fevered cheek. That bowl sits in her satchel like a neutral companion. Some nights later, despite Hella's ministrations, Jory's condition worsens. The villagers murmur. In the small world of the village, death's closeness requires explanation. People begin to scan their lives for breaches. Had the water stank that morning? Had someone cursed the child? Had some faith been neglected? In such climates, stories proliferate with the urgency of people seeking cause and cure. Neighbors begin to recall oddities they had earlier dismissed. A mirror brought recently into a house, a stranger who lingered at the edge of the common, a woman who hummed at midnight. Pieces assemble into narratives, not because they are necessarily true, but because narrative offers a sense of control. Rumor finds its way to the mayor, to the priest, to the hedge that divides fields, and then, inevitably, to Maud the weaver's house. There is a particular logic to the way rumor moves. It seeks easier explanations, and in this case, it is the mirror that offers a tidy symbol. That object had been at the center of recent disputes. It is portable, visible, and already freighted with local meaning. People begin to suggest that perhaps the mirror brought misfortune into homes. Someone whispers that Maud had been seen talking to it at night. Someone else adds that she had once hosted a woman who had a reputation for strange remedies. The gossip accumulates into a chorus, less interested in truth than in a deliverable cause. Maud is aware of the fray. She is not a woman with a neat defense for the tangled economy of rumor. Instead, she is a plain soul who weaves cloth by the light of a small lamp, and who worries about her neighbor's children as if they were kin. Her mirror sits wrapped in linen on a high shelf, a domestic object that until recently was part of the shared rhythm of the house. When the whispers reach her ears, she comes down with a bowl of porridge and tries to attend to the immediate needs, the sick, the hungry, the frightened. But such practical care does not address the communal hunger for attribution. People need someone to point to, and in the acute distress of illness that hunger sharpens. A meeting is convened in the chapel, where people are used to turning grief into liturgy. The priest stands at the pulpit and calls for calm, invoking scripture on the mystery of suffering. He says softly that the community must not leap to judgment. For a moment, reason seems to prevail. The people bend their heads, they bring food, they keep watch over the sick. Yet under the surface unease grows. When a second child falls ill in a neighboring household, the pattern hardens into a perceived epidemic. The mayor suggests that perhaps mundane causes should be sought more diligently. A contaminated well, poor grain storage. But questions of causation rarely stay purely technical in these times. Social tensions strain. Neighbors who once shared bread now speak in measured phrases. The mirror, because it is a concrete object with a dubious reputation, becomes material for a more decisive action. A group of villagers, anxious and convinced by the evidence of coincidence and rumor, decide that they must secure sources of fear lest the sickness spread further. They petition the magistrate to allow them to search houses for objects associated with suspect practices. The petition is phrased carefully to avoid the language of witchcraft, a dangerous term that could inflame passions and attract higher authorities. But its intent is clear: to remove potential threats. Master Corbin, who has presided over the earlier theft case, hears the petition. He is a man who prefers the law to rumor, who knows that a legal sanction must be justified by evidence, yet he also understands the dynamics of social unrest. If he denies the petition outright, the villagers may take matters into their own hands, and disorder could follow. He reads the faces in the chamber, and recognizes a pattern of fear he cannot dismiss. He grants a limited search, a temporary seizure of objects deemed potentially hazardous, to be conducted under the oversight of the local clergy. It is a decision meant to palatably combine legal authority with communal urgency. The search begins with reluctance and a heavy hand. Houses are opened, chests are lifted. In Maud's home, the linen wrapping is undone. The mirror, small and quiet, is held up and examined. Some nearby observers gasp, but not because they see anything supernatural, only because the object's presence so easily catalyzes fear. The priest offers a prayer, and the object is placed into a crate for secure keeping until the crisis is better understood. The act of taking the mirror is for many an act of relief. Something standing in the center of anxiety has been moved. But for others, it is an act of violence against privacy and property, a symbolic punishment before any guilt has been established. Its destiny becomes a matter for debate among more than townsfolk. Representatives of neighboring villages, some informed by guilds, some by local clergy, come to weigh in. It is at once a local problem and a test case for regional authority. Does a community have the right to seize an object on the basis of rumor? How can the law protect rights while also maintaining public order? The arguments are not purely theoretical. They are deeply embedded in the daily concerns and seasonal fears people navigate. Meanwhile, Healer continues her work, moving between bedsides, offering herbs and compassion. She is not a woman who seeks to inflame trouble, she seeks to heal. But even her efforts are caught in the social undertow. Some villagers suspect her because she uses reflective bowls to inspect fevers, and suspicion often attaches to those whose expertise is hard for others to understand. Hella finds herself defending her practice in quiet conversations at thresholds, explaining plant names and the signs she looks for. Her candor wins some friends but not all. In a world where knowledge is power, the lines between skillful practice and suspect craft are thin and cross-cutting. As these tensions continue, the bishop's office receives a measured report. Word of the seizures and searches has travelled beyond the village's hedgerows. The bishop, a careful man, wants to avoid a frenzied reaction that could escalate into broader hysteria. He dispatches a learned delegate, an itinerant official trained in both law and theology, to come and observe the situation. The delegate arrives, sober and inquisitive, and requests to see the items that were seized. He lifts it, looks into the glass without a tremor, and then turns it to inspect its frame. He notices the maker's mark, the traces of a guild's craft, and asks curious, technical questions about the material. He listens to testimony with a patient ear. What the delegate brings to the scene is a certain procedural temper. He models that institutions can address fear by applying standards of evidence and by asking technical questions about objects and their provenance. Under his guidance, a medical practitioner from a nearby town is consulted to test water sources and grain stores. The practitioner notes that a mid-season harvest and improper grain storage are plausible culprits for spreading disease. The magistrate issues public measures, improvements to grain storage practices, a communal cleaning of the well, an instruction to ventilate cattle sheds. With such practical steps, the immediate environmental causes of illness are addressed. The mirror's place shifts as well. Now examined by technical eyes and placed under an institutional shelter, it starts to lose its aura as the scapegoat for the village's misfortunes. Yet rumor has a stubborn life. People continue to tell stories that stitch together the mirror and the illness. Some prefer a supernatural explanation because it offers moral closure. If a person or object is to blame, the community can act decisively to correct it. Others prefer structural solutions because they address material causes. The village finds itself tugged between these registers of meaning. The new grain storage practices reduce infestation. The well is cleaned and the water tastes clearer. Illnesses that had been opportunistic lose some of their virulence. The proportion of sickness declines. People begin to breathe more freely. In the pragmatic ledger of cause and effect, the mirror did not cure or cause the illness. It was part of a larger social tableau that shaped how people responded. Yet for certain folk, the mirror remains a poignant symbol of fear, while for others, it becomes a mere domestic object returned to its place. Maud's mirror is returned, but not without ceremony. The priest performs a ritual of purification for the household, invoking God's blessing upon the family and exhorting the community to practice mercy. The restoration is public. The villagers gather in the chapel. The mirror is displayed, and a small prayer is offered. The ritual is less about the object itself and more about reconstituting the social fabric. People need such gestures to reassure one another that the threat has been addressed and that communal bonds are mended. The mirror, wrapped again in linen, is put back on Maud's shelf, and daily life resumes with new attentiveness. Yet not all wounds are healed by pragmatic measures or ceremonial reintegration. Stories have a persistence that resists tidy endings. Some villagers continue to tell the tale of the mirror and the sick children, embellishing details, preserving grievances, and using the story to warn younger generations. A child hears the story and grows up more cautious before reflective surfaces. A mother wraps mirrors when a new baby is born because the story has become a ritual of caution. Cultural memory works in these ways. Narratives outlast the empirical facts that birthed them, and they shape the behaviors of later generations in subtle ways. Meanwhile, the economic and technological trends we have traced continue to unfold. Mirrors become more available. Guilds standardize production, and markets integrate them into household economies. As they do, the cultural friction around them shifts in emphasis. Where once a mirror might immediately inspire fear, later households develop sets of protocols, covering for births, blessing when moving a mirror, or limiting mirror use in certain rituals. The object becomes domesticated in most places, even if echoes of earlier anxieties persist in custom and caution. But even as mirrors lose some of their terror, their symbolic richness endures. Artists continue to draw on their power. Writers use mirror metaphors to explore conscience and self-knowledge. The mirror, we might say, has transcended merely being an object. It is now a trope for human introspection, social ambiguity, and the tension between the public and the private. In that sense, the medieval terror of mirrors gives way to a more complex cultural legacy. The object remains an instrument, but it is also a mirror in a metaphorical sense, reflecting our moral concerns back to us. Let us look for a moment at the artisans who adapted to changing times. Some mirror makers found ways to codify their craft, to combine technical transparency with ritual assurances. They learned to stamp clear hallmarks, and to keep records of sales, to participate in communal liturgies when requested, and to secure guild charters that linked their trade to civic stability. By doing so, they not only protected their livelihoods, but also provided neighbors with a way to trust objects they'd bought. This is an example of how institutions and markets can collaborate to reduce fear, not by denying the existence of fear, but by channeling it into predictable, human-made processes. Other artisans, of course, resisted such codification. Some itinerant makers refused to be bound by municipal controls, trading across borders and keeping secrets of their craft. Their objects continued to bear an air of foreignness, and communities often took extra care with such mirrors, blessing them, keeping them covered, or avoiding them altogether. The existence of both regulated and itinerant production sustained a plural field of meanings, a world in which mirrors could be either ordinary or exotic, depending on their origin and use. As the decades pass, the historical arc winds towards a broader transformation in culture. The emergence of portraiture, the growth of urban life, the increased literacy, and the gradual secularization of certain spheres of life all contribute to a new equilibrium for mirrors. Increased exposure to images reshapes visual literacy and social practices. People become more accustomed to seeing themselves as discrete visual entities. In some ways, this is an expansion of human capacity to manage identity. In other ways, it carries the risk of new anxieties about authenticity and performance. But the medieval phase of mirror lore leaves enduring marks. The rituals, covering during mourning, blessing before use, burying shards, linger. Even in later centuries, traces of these practices persist as folk customs or as literary allusions. That endurance is not a sign of static superstition, but of adaptive cultural memory. Communities inherit practices because they once had purposes that made sense in specific contexts. Those practices evolve and sometimes find new rationales, but their forms can survive. In considering this long weave, one senses that the medieval fear of mirrors was less about glass than about exposure. Exposure of the self, exposure of secrets, exposure of the porous border between inner life and social world. Mirrors amplified the experience of exposure. They made visible what people had often experienced only indirectly. The way others see them, the way their own face can betray their inner state, the way objects can be implicated in social order. The medieval response, rituals, laws, stories, was a suite of strategies for managing exposure. They are not foolish strategies. They are human ones. As we near the end of this story, let me bring you back to a quiet image. Anna, the child who once sat at Elsbeth's feet, now plays with a wooden spool, occasionally peeking at the mirror edge with childish curiosity. For her, the object is not yet a symbol of fear, but a possible toy. Her grandmother rubs the mirror's frame dust, free now and then, smoothing the linen like a grandmother might smooth a brow. These small domestic acts, wrapping, blessing, returning to the ordinary, are the stitches by which communities heal after fear. In the years that follow, Maud's mirror will continue to be passed around in the ways household goods often are, brought out for a wedding, wrapped for a burial, cleaned for a new bride. Its story will be told at table, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes as an oddity. People will pass on what they have learned, that the presence of an object can catalyze more than it deserves, that practical measures can often resolve problems more thoroughly than accusations, and that rituals can knit neighbors back together if they are performed with compassion. There is an important final point here. The medieval fear of mirrors, as we have traced it, is not a relic to be derided, but a human response to a particular configuration of technology, belief, and social risk. The fear emerges from real conditions: limited medical knowledge, porous metaphysical boundaries, gendered anxieties, and fragile civic infrastructures. The remedies people invented, blessings, regulations, rituals, are pragmatic and sometimes elegant. They are part of the long human record of trying to live with the unknown. And now, as we slowly gather our thoughts and let the night wind down, consider how different, yet how similar our relationship with mirrors remains. You might look at your phone screen or the glass on a bedside table and think of how casually we now consult these reflective surfaces. Yet the old anxieties about how we are seen, about how images shape identity, about the uses and misuses of representation, still hover in our culture in new forms. The medium changes, but the human questions persist. Who gets to control images? If you are still awake, take a soft breath. Allow your shoulders to loosen. Imagine the simple domestic scenes we have walked through: the candle guttering at a window, the healer's gentle touch, the mirror wrapped and placed back upon a high shelf. These scenes are quiet anchors. Let them rest in your mind like a warm, uncomplicated image. If you are still awake, I hope you are feeling a little more peaceful than when we began. Take your time, relax, and let sleep arrive whenever it chooses. If you enjoyed this quiet exploration, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters more than you know. Thank you for spending this quiet journey with me. Until our next story, this is Thomas, wishing you a peaceful night. Good night.